The South is no place for a boy with peculiar grace. I'll go north, I'll make my way. Nothing can stop me, no reason to stay. The South is no place for a boy with peculiar grace. Sweet, so sweet. Now you do me. Relax. It's just a game. Rules don't apply to you and I.
Good afternoon and welcome to the debut of the Capehart podcast on Washington Post Live. I am Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Fire Shut Up in My Bones is the poignant memoir written by New York Times columnist Charles Blow in 2014. Renowned trumpeter and composer Terence Blanchard, along with librettist Casey Lemons, turned it into an opera that debuted at Opera Theater of St. Louis in 2019. But in September 2021, Fire Shut Up in My Bones broke through a huge artistic barrier. Not only did it open the new season at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, it made history as the first opera by a Black composer to be performed at the Met. And those two gentlemen, Charles Blow and Terence Blanchard, join me now. Gentlemen, welcome to Capehart.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So, Terence, I'll start with you. What did it mean to you to have this work open the season at the Met?
Well, I mean, it meant a lot, obviously, to be the first thing to open the season after this 22-month period of isolation. It was a really powerful thing for the performers involved, for all of the people on the staff and everybody who came to the performance, so I was really excited about the entire thing.
And why do you think it took until 2021 for an opera by Black composer to debut at the Met? From what I understand, you didn't know that until a reporter mentioned it to you.
No, I had no idea. The answer to the first part of the question, I have no idea. That's a question for the Met. I think you would have to ask them. I just remember looking in a ledger where they had this information about operas that had been rejected by the Met. And William Grant Still, who's a great African-American composer, his name was in it 3 times. And actually, I also saw some women's names in the same book. So I was really just heartbroken by what I was reading. And to think that it took this long to have such an event occur is a travesty. But kudos to Peter Gelb and Yannick and everybody there at the Met for wanting to right this wrong and move forward.
So, Charles, I want to get into your memoir, which is the basis of this opera, before coming back to Terence. But your memoir is poignant and powerful as it is painful. You write about the bullying and the sexual abuse you endured, among other painful memories and encounters. Did you have any, it's one thing to write it in a book, but did you have any trepidation in your story being converted into an opera?
I don't think trepidation is the right way to put it. I think, there is, in the writing of a memoir, there are 2 things operating simultaneously. There's the story of your life, and then there's the craft of writing. And so you can appreciate the craft of the art separately from whatever ups and downs may have happened in the life. And I think that when thinking about translation of the art into other forms, that makes complete sense. I have no real worry about the story being translated. But I will say this, though. I mean, a lot of people have, asked me about how it feels in your life and you're alive. And, people who have operas about their lives are generally not alive if they're about real people. I will say that, it is a strange feeling, and I could not stay in it, right? So I've seen the opera once in St. Louis. I saw it once in New York, and that was about as much as I wanted to see it. Not because I didn't appreciate it. It was beautifully done. Terrence's music is amazing. Kissy's writing is great. The performers are great. It is just that, when, for me, this was a buried part of my life, and I resurrected it to write about it because I thought it would be helpful to other people. And that, that's I wrote over 9 years, and not all the time. And then I published it. It was great. We did the book tour, and I basically let it go back to sleep, And then to create to embark on this journey where Terence and Kessie and Jim were turning into an opera, I had to resurrect it again. And then to go back and see it, I had to resurrect it again. And it is not the easiest part of my life. It is, some parts of it is beautiful, but some parts of it is traumatic. And you just can't stay in that. And so for me, I need to make sure that I honor the fact that it's happening, and also remember that that is not currently my life, and that I can't stay in that, and I can't relive that on a stage over and over and over.
And, Terence, I mean, it's very powerful what Charles just said, that he wrote the book. And I remember interviewing Charles at Aspen Ideas after it came out. And I told everyone in the audience, if you want to understand the power that drives his columns in the New York Times, read this book, because it is all revealed. And as he said, he let it go back to sleep. What was it about Charles's memoir, about his story, that said to you, I want to do something bigger with this? And how hard did you have to convince Charles to say yes?
Well, convincing Charles wasn't that hard. I mean, he really didn't see how we were going to make it into an opera, and me trying to explain it, I wasn't going to be good at it. So I let Jim do all of that work. But what he just talked about was extremely powerful, and was one of the reasons why I wanted to do his story. When I read the book, obviously I wasn't molested as a kid, but there are parts of his story that do resonate in my life, in terms of, wanting to belong to a community that doesn't necessarily understand who you are, what you're about. And truthfully, at a time when you're trying to figure it out yourself, you know what I mean? You just realize that some of the things in your community are not for you, and some things are. And that can be traumatic and be confusing for a kid. But I think the most important thing about it all for me was to see Charles's life as a successful writer, to see where his career has gone and how he's blossomed into this beautiful spirit that has helped a lot of people grapple with very tough topics, in our daily lives. And I think, to show the trajectory from him going through that and coming through all of that to be this writer, in my mind, was something that I thought could really help a lot of people. And truth be told, at each performance, afterwards, there's literally someone who will come up to me and say thank you, because they were either, a victim of child abuse, or they had other issues that they were dealing with. And the opera allowed them first to grieve and accept what it is that they've gone through, and hopefully, be able to move forward, and become empowered, in their progression.
In the opera and in the intro that we just showed, the very last scene that we showed is the young Charles baby, and then older Charles and then I believe it's the uncle in a very tense scene. And in Charles, in the opera, the characters that are playing, as we saw in that scene, they are layered strategically to mimic the style you employed in your memoir. And I'm wondering, when in doing that, where it seems as though Terence is trying to guide the boy through the older Charles is trying to guide the younger Charles through his formative years. And I'm wondering, how did Terence do in portraying your coming to terms with the trauma you experienced as a child through this opera?
Well, first of all, I think they were free to do things that I couldn't in memoir, right? So to present both characters on stage at the same time, I couldn't do that in written form. To personify destiny or fate was something that I could not do. I mean, I guess I could have, if I thought to do it in that way, but that's not the kind of classical way to write memoir, and that wasn't the way that I used. So they used a lot of devices that I did not use in the book. So that was interesting to see how that all worked, and I think as a creative device, it did work. The the thing about the opera, though, I think Terence or someone told me this. Terence, did you tell me this about like how much longer it takes to sing a word than to say it?
Yeah.
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 Right. Meaning
Yeah.
the opera is incredibly short
Right.
relative to what
Right.
if you tried to sing the whole book, you'd be there all night, right? So
Right.
you have to make artistic choices about what is included, what is not included. Also, it is a stage production, so you can't constantly change the scene as you might do in a book. You can do it as often as you like. In movie format, you can do it a bit more. On a stage, there's only so many times you can wheel that scene off and bring another one on. So you're also then trapped by how many scenes you can present. And so they had to make all those choices. And so I was very interested, particularly the first time, to see which choices they made about which things the to exclude and to maintain story and to develop characters and the arc of the narrative. And I think it works as its own piece of art. I do believe that that it does, because opera also has to be dramatic. There are a lot of subtle moments that were important to me that just didn't make it, right? So that's just part of translation. So I try not to gauge it against the book, but to accept that it is a different, new piece of art created by Terence and Cassie and James, and that I appreciate it for that.
So, Terence, let's talk about the nitty gritty here, because Fire Shut Up in My Bones is your second opera. Your first was Champion in 2013, which was directed by my old friend James Robinson. You mentioned Jim earlier. That's who you were talking about. And James is the co-director with Camille Brown of Fire. But opera is not your first medium for musical composition. You are best known as a multiple Grammy-winning jazz trumpeter and band leader, and I'll add great musician, great jazz musician. Anyone who has watched a Spike Lee movie over the last 30 years has heard and been moved by your stirring, majestic scores. So, given that you're part of the jazz firmament, what inspired opera as the format for this specific story?
Well, one of the things, a lot of people who know me, they know that my father was an amateur baritone. He loved opera. So I heard opera a lot growing up in the house. And one of the things that has always been curious to me, about, especially in the African American community, is how there's so many people in our community who love the music and love opera, but there's not many formats or pieces actually created for them. I mean, we could talk about Porgy and Bess, but still created for them by African Americans. I mean, at least, let me put it this way. There are pieces out there, but pieces that are gaining traction, and to have the opportunity to do something at the Met, on this scale was a very intriguing thing for me. Now, obviously, we started in St. Louis, and one of the things that I really started to realize immediately was that African American opera singers don't get a chance to really fully bring to the table everything that they grow up with. Most of them grow up singing in the church or singing rhythm blues or jazz. And when it comes time to sing Tosca, or Labawem or Turandot, they're told to turn those things off, and for me, that's a big part of who they are. And one of the things that I love in being in this world is that I get a chance to create some pieces that allow them to bring all of who they are, to the fray. I mean, when you listen to Angel Blue, when she sings Peculiar Grace, she mixes her operatic voice, with this gospel spiritual color that's very moving and very haunting, and I think when you put that together with great acting, great scenery, the entire art form is a very powerful way to tell stories. I've been telling people, stop thinking opera. This is the highest form of musical theater that you can ever experience. And I truly believe that. And with the performances of Fire, I think, people were extremely moved by the entire production, by seeing it all come together, and there's nothing like that I've ever experienced.
To your point, Terence, Camille Brown, who's also the opera's choreographer, she said in an interview that what comes with you being the first Black composer on the Met stage is, quote, the Black lens, and along with that comes Black culture spoken through or danced through the Black lens. I mean, you talked about that just a moment ago, but Charles, I would love to get your perspective on that. How important is it that what Terence was just talking about, allowing Black opera performers to bring all of themselves to a role, but also to have a story such as yours told through the lens of a Black composer and told through the performances of Black opera singers?
Well, I've said this before. I was very happy that this opera brought opera to the Black experience, not Black experience into the opera. Meaning, it needed to come to us, right, and to understand that you can have a beautiful production, but also an amazing story that just is about us. It doesn't depend on, it is not reactionary to other people, it is not a response. It is an expression of the human condition as expressed by human beings. These human beings happen to be Black. And that was important to me because there are almost no white characters in my book, because it's not about characters, because these are just people in my life. And I grew up in an all-Black town. Went to all Black schools. I was around Black people, and that wasn't a choice to exclude anybody else. It was just the circumstance under which I grew up. And so to be true to that, that means that you do bring Black culture in abundance to this production.
And can I add to that?
Sure, go ahead, Terence.
Something real quick. It's really beautiful to hear Charles say that, because one of the things that we kept thinking, we didn't know it was an all-Black cast. We didn't realize it was an all-Black cast. We were just doing an opera. We were doing Charles's story. And again, it was somebody else that came up to us and said, well, man, this is an all-Black cast, and we were like, oh, I guess it is. So to his point, we weren't trying to exclude anybody. We weren't trying to necessarily make a statement on that front. We were just trying to tell his story the best way we could.
One thing that came up in my research and all this, when Fire was performed in St. Louis, it was I believe it was a co-ed group of dancers, but Fire on the Met stage was all men. What was the thinking behind that, particularly on the fraternity, the step scene?
Well, I think that was a choice that was made by Camille and Jim. The story was definitely about Charles, and Charles, struggling with his own sexuality. And when you look at the ballet that opens up the second act of the opera, I think Camille did an amazing job of creating something that told his story. you know. So it was a choice. It was a creative choice to kind of help push along the narrative of what was going on in Charles's life at that time, you know. And then I think it makes it even more powerful a moment when he meets Greta in the opera, and then he starts to date her, and then he starts to reveal to her everything that happened to him, you know. But it was a beautiful choice because when you see the step show, you know, when you see the ballet, those dancers did an amazing job. As a matter of fact, you know, I always kid him. You know, I said, "Man, I've never seen nobody get a standing ovation just for walking on the stage." You know, you know, the first time I've ever seen that.
I want to talk about one of the arias, "Bend Don't Break,"
Mhm,
and the powerful lyrics go, I sway, my roots run deep. I draw my strength from underneath. I
mhm,
bend, I don't break, I sway." And
mhm,
to hear Will Liverman deliver those words is so powerful. But what just sort of knocked me back and
mhm,
moved me to no end was when the I becomes we
mhm,
towards the
mhm.
end of the aria. And like I said, I can't even begin to describe how much it moved me. What have you heard from others about that aria?
Oh, well, for me, you know, that's one of the pivotal moments. That and Peculiar Grace. You know, when you say we bend, we don't break, it seems to be the rallying cry for a lot of people, a lot of disenfranchised people, a lot of people who have suffered through the development of this country. You know, I look at everything that I grew up, witnessed growing up, and just trying to maintain daily life, you know, in my family and the struggles that my parents went through, you know, to keep us afloat. And then, you know, keep me in music lessons and keep me pushing forward and allowing me to have a dream. You know, there were moments, you know, that were very stressful for all of us. And I think everybody can really relate to that. It's one of the things that I kept hearing from a lot of people who came to the opera. That thing was something that they started to chant, you know, outside of the performances. You know, it's one of the things I think that even some of the dancers they would talk about before the show would start. You know, we bend, we don't break. You know, and it became a rallying cry for a lot of students that also had seen the broadcast of the opera.
Hmm. You know, Charles, that phrase, "We bend, we don't break, we sway," it would be like a nice mantra for what you bring to your columns at the Times. It's a perfect encapsulation, at least to my
But
mind.
can I just
Uh,
say,
yeah,
can
go
I say
ahead,
this
Charles.
about that? This is one of those instances where, you know, when you do something artistically, you come to it with one sensibility, but the people who appreciate it see something bigger
Mm,
than what
mm,
you were intending.
Hmm.
I first heard people talk about it uh, as a kind of a metaphor for Black struggle in America only in the reviews
mm,
of this opera, not even in the book. And that was not, and I could understand that, but it was not, it was not the intention. Uh, you know, that idea came from, for me, a communion with nature, right?
mm,
And that I spent many days uh, kind of meditating in a forested area that where the trees to me look like a cathedral, right? And so it became for me a metaphor for a religious space. And in that space, the way I described it, the trees spoke to me and taught me things about resilience and weathering the storms and bending but not breaking, about being deeply rooted. And that I had carried that lesson from nature, from those trees out into my life. And that I thought about them all the time in that way, that if they can weather that hurricane, I can. And so it was very specific to me. I wasn't trying to make a statement about Blackness in America, but then when other people made that connection, I thought, oh, that's, you could say that too, you know. But it's very interesting to me how art can speak to other people in other ways.
You know, and that's what's funny. I forgot to mention, because it's plainly obvious, that the reason why those lyrics hit me, you know, so hard in a beautiful way was that, yeah, as a Black man, listening to the words, seeing them performed, just spoke to something that was just larger than the intention of those words. But in the 5 minutes that we have left, real quick, I'm going to go to an audience question for Terence. Terence, this comes from Scott in Iceland. Did the existence of large-scale jazz works by Coltrane or Ellington have an effect on the composition? Were there things you avoided or things you referenced?
Well, I never really try to reference anything directly because, you know, I'm always trying to find my own voice, but I'm always influenced by anything great, you know, and of course, you know, anything Duke Ellington has done, or John Coltrane, those happen to be two of my favorite artists, has had an effect on me, you know. But, you know, I studied with a guy named Roger Dickinson, who studied in Austria and came back to New Orleans and to teach. And he taught me composition from the time that I was 16 years old. And he's the guy that whenever I have a major project or something to do, I still call him to this day, you know. And when I called him to do my first opera, Champion, I remember he told me, he said, stop thinking about, you know, writing an opera. He said, tell a story. And that's what I've tried to do. The difference is that I've tried to bring all of my background to bear. That's why we call it an opera in jazz and not a jazz opera. We don't want people to think that you're going to hit the Basie band or the Ellington band when you come to the performance. But the DNA from all of those languages and all of and both cultures will exist, because I'm also a big fan of Puccini as well. You know, La Boheme is one of my favorite operas of all time, like it is for most. So I'm trying to use everything at my disposal to tell this story in the most succinct way I can, and also the most interestingly artistic way that I can.
Well, I'm sorry, Terence. My favorite opera is Tosca, and Leontine Price will always be Tosca to me. All right, in the 2 minutes, in the 2 minutes that we have left, I have a question for each of you. And Terence, I'll have you go first. What do you want people to take away from the work you've done in Fire Shut Up in My Bones?
I want people to learn that no matter what it is you go through, you know, the old saying is God never gives you anything you can't handle. You know, you have the strength, you know, to forge ahead and persevere. You know, this, and Charles' life, his existence is an example of that.
And Charles, what do you want people to take away from your story?
Well, first, you know, like Terence said, God don't give you too much hints. Sometimes you're like, sir, ma'am, who told you that? Like, who told you these shows you can hold on this? Somebody lied to you. Anyway, but I think the thing to take away for me is the realization that there are no small lives, that every life is grand, right? And so it was hard, you know, it was the biggest thing about this being on the Met stage to me was to hear references to my hometown or to my church or whatever. Because, and I, you know, I was back in my hometown of 900 people for Thanksgiving, and they, you know, they just freak out because they're like, who would have thought that this town would be mentioned in anything, right? And because we thought ourselves living in a tiny space that time and the world was passing over. But there are no spaces like that. Every life is an opportunity. Every life is a story. Every life is grand.
Charles Blow, Terence Blanchard, thank you so much for coming to Capehart. It truly has been an honor.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
And thank you for joining us. To check out what interviews we have coming up, head to WashingtonPostLive.com. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thanks for watching Capehart on Washington Post Live.